Okay, well, welcome everyone. My name is Arik Burakovsky. I manage the Russia and Eurasia Program here at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And we're delighted to have you join us for what promises to be a fascinating and timely conversation with our distinguished guest speaker, Ambassador John J. Sullivan. We're honored to host him at Fletcher today for our 6th annual U.S. Russia Relations Book Prize event. The award recognizes an outstanding book on historical or contemporary foreign policy discourse on the past or present of U.S. Russia relations. Please note that the event is being recorded. The Russia and Eurasia Program at Fletcher supports teaching and research on a wide range of contemporary and historical issues surrounding Russia, Eastern Europe, Central Asia, and the Caucasus. Our U.S. Russia Relations Initiative has been supported generously over the last 8 years by the Carnegie Corporation of New York. My colleagues, Professors Dresner and Miller, who co-direct the program, will introduce our esteemed guest and moderate the conversation tonight. Daniel Dresner is a distinguished professor of international politics and associate dean of research here at Fletcher. He teaches economic statecraft, U.S. grand strategy, global political economy, and power and world politics. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. Chris Miller is a professor of international history here at Fletcher. He teaches the histories of U.S. and Russian foreign policy. His expertise includes Russian political economy and foreign policy, as well as semiconductors and the role of technology in geopolitics. He is also a non-resident senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. So after a brief presentation of the book by Ambassador Sullivan, Professor Miller will ask him several questions before taking questions from the audience, from all of you, including both in person and virtual via Zoom. I will now turn it over to Professor Dresner to introduce Ambassador Sullivan and award him the book prize.
Thank you very much, Arik. It is a pleasure to be the host for Ambassador Sullivan for his second favorite trip to Boston in the last week, because my understanding is that last week he got to address the BC college hockey team. And one of the things you will learn if you read this wonderful book is that Ambassador Sullivan is a diehard hockey fan. Hockey died for me, just for the record, when the Hartford Whalers left Hartford. So I have a very different perspective on this. But that's a conversation for another day. I highly recommend that you read this engaging book. I'm going to just steal one anecdote that is in the very first part of the book, which is Ambassador Sullivan, when he was stationed in Moscow, when the war was imminent, had established a code word that his intelligence officer could speak to him on the phone because it was obviously going to be bugged. And would signal that the war had started. And I apologize for the impersonation I'm about to do, but the code word was from the movie Predator. And the code was, "Get to the chopper." So, John J. Sullivan is a lawyer and former U.S. ambassador to the Russian Federation under both Presidents Joe Biden and Donald Trump. Prior to his posting in Moscow, he served for almost 3 years as U.S. Deputy Secretary of State. He has served 4 U.S. presidents. Beyond the State Department, he served as the Deputy Secretary of Commerce under George W. Bush, and before that worked in the counsel's office at both the Department of Defense and the Department of Justice. He's currently a partner at Mayer Brown LLP, a distinguished fellow at both Georgetown University and Columbia University, a member of the congressionally chartered Bipartisan Commission on Reform and Modernization of the Department of State, and has recently become chairman of the board for the U.S. Institute of Peace. So he's going to lead an interesting life for the next couple of years. Ambassador Sullivan, it is my honor to present to you the Fletcher Russia and Eurasia Program U.S. Russia Relations Book Prize. Please accept this. Ambassador Sullivan, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Oh, this is terrific. Thank you so much so that you give you a sense of who I am. I often like to start my remarks by describing my experience in Moscow, and I paraphrase Mark Twain. I was a Boston Irishman in Vladimir Putin's court. It was an amazing experience. I'm not an expert on Russian history. I don't speak Russian, but I consider myself and describe myself in my book as an amateur Russophile. So enamored of the people, the culture, the history, that on my own, once I was there, I started taking Russian language lessons 3 nights a week. But I'm an amateur. I'm here to tell you, though, what I saw. And as I mentioned to Professors Denzer and Miller, what I saw is also informed by the fact that while I was in Moscow during the pandemic, I had a lot of time on my hands. And as a result, I spent a lot of time with my colleagues from the intelligence community getting an advanced degree in Vladimir Putin and the Russian Federation, at least what the Russian government, the United States government and a segment of it thinks of Vova, the dear Russian president. I hope we can get into the origins of the war and what I think about the future and the current administration's effort to stop the war, to stop the violence. Let me just give you some headlines up front. Vladimir Putin is not going to negotiate. He is not capable of negotiating over Ukraine. Now, I'm not saying we, the United States, shouldn't talk to Russia, talk to Putin. It's just if you tell my former colleagues, my dear friends at the Department of State, that we're going to start preparing for a negotiation, the first thing I guarantee, people will sit down and they'll, well, as a good faith gesture, we should, we just don't have, it's difficult for us as a government to negotiate with the Russians because it's hard for people to really understand the people we are talking to and how they approach us. Putin will never surrender his war aims. His war aims are to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. He's been consistent about this since the start of the war. He will not change. He will not negotiate those war aims. They are non-negotiable. Lavrov just said this within the last 24 hours. Lavrov, asking about efforts by the Trump administration to engage with the Russian government. And Lavrov has said, well, President Putin, we've made clear what our position is, and it needs to take into account facts on the ground. And those facts on the ground, of course, mean territory, Ukrainian territory seized by Russia, that Russia now, under its amended constitution, amended at Vladimir Putin's request in early 2020, is now unconstitutional for Russia to surrender any territory that is now Russian territory. At the time, everyone was focused on another constitutional amendment, which changed the term limits in the Russian constitution and allowed Putin to run for re-election in 2024, the end of his last 2-term stretch when he would have otherwise had to leave office. But that constitutional provision is important as a signal of what the Russian government's view is. Now, let me also say, I think, and this is just speculation on my part, if you had given Putin the opportunity before the war started and given him this choice, on the one hand, no invasion, no hundreds of thousands of casualties, no calamitous war, and you get control over Kyiv the way you have control over Minsk. You expand the Union state between Belarus and Russia to include Ukraine. Ukraine never joins NATO. There's no military threat to the Russian Federation. But Ukraine is not absorbed into the Russian Federation. I bet Putin would have taken that deal. Having, however, launched the special military operation, suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties, seized and incorporated this territory in Ukraine, in the Donbass and earlier Crimea, he can never surrender that territory. Never. He can't do what Lyndon Johnson did in 1968, right? When, Johnson's war, 500,000 US troops sent to Southeast Asia in the Vietnam War, and then the Tet Offensive in late January of 1968, Johnson decides he's not going to run for re-election and he's going to retire to the LBJ ranch and let his hair grow. Putin can't do that. I don't know if he could let his hair grow the way Johnson did, but even if he could, he can't just retire to Sochi and leave office and just say, boy, what a big mistake. Putin himself, by the way, has already admitted within weeks of the start of the special military operation, he's already said, he said this to the Israeli prime minister who was visiting Moscow. This is March of 22. Shows you how the world has changed, right? Particularly since October 7th, an Israeli prime minister, Bennett, meeting with Putin in Moscow. And Putin says to him, as Bennett has now told the media, Putin said, boy, the Ukrainians were tougher than we thought. They had more will and capability to resist. And our military, we weren't as good as we thought we were. And that's Putin would never admit that, obviously, publicly, but that's quite a thing for someone, a Chekist like Putin to admit that to anybody, let alone a foreign leader, an Israeli prime minister. But he was just admitting the truth. But it doesn't cause him to say, and therefore we are going to compromise, etc. His conclusion is it's just going to take us longer to do what we need to do. And what do we need to do? Denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. So I hope we can have a conversation first with Professor Miller and then with you in the audience, particularly on the way ahead, what this means for the West, for the United States, for the new administration. But I think it's important that we understand the government, the leader that we're dealing with. This is not a government, the Russian Federation under Vladimir Putin, it's not a government that is deal making in the sense that President Trump thinks of deal making from his days in real estate in New York. And Putin is, as he describes himself, a KGB man. He is a Russian nationalist, and he is just not going to compromise. This is so much a part of beyond, whether he could survive physically, surrendering his war aims in Ukraine, survive physically, leave in office or out of office. It's just not who he is, his view of the world of Russia, his mission, this whole enterprise that he's been on since, for the last 25 plus years. So it's not an optimistic message that I bring, particularly to my colleagues back in Washington. But I think it's certainly my realistic assessment of the government that the United States is dealing with. And I saw it in matters small, relatively small, in the operations of our embassy, in dealing with the Russians on that, to large matters, and that was the negotiations, or I should strike that word, the discussions we had with the Russians in the months leading up to the invasion in February of 2022. It is not like dealing with any other government. And my concern is that we in the United States, and particularly in the administration, are not prepared for the counterparty that they're going to be dealing with. So with that introduction, maybe we could have a conversation.
And to flip a switch.
The FSB used to do that for me.
Full service. Well, I'd love to pick up on the many themes you referenced regarding to the future of U.S. Russia relations and the war, but perhaps to start on your own background and how you found yourself in the
Sure.
role of U.S. ambassador. You were in the position of Deputy Secretary of State, which is not an easy job, and then you chose an even harder job to be appointed to Moscow. What inspired that decision?
Well, I actually thought that the job as ambassador to Russia was in many ways less stressful, because the Russians are so predictable. What I found difficult of being Deputy Secretary of State was the unpredictability of changes in policy. It was much more chaotic. In Moscow, as ambassador, it's predictable. We say or do X, the Russians guaranteed will say or do Y. And we have to plan for it and adjust accordingly. So it's a different type of stress, the uncertainty, because it is, as Deputy Secretary, it was the uncertainty that made the job stressful. In Moscow, there's certainty, but it's certainty in a very oppressive, the most dangerous for a U.S. diplomat or any U.S. government official counterintelligence environment in any country in the world. The FSB, and I think I'm going to get my figures roughly accurate, the FSB is approximately 350,000 officers and more junior personnel. To give you a sense of comparison, FBI is maybe 35,000. The unit within the FSB, DCRO-1, the counterintelligence unit within the FSB, that's dedicated just to smothering the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 7,000 to 8,000 personnel, because they have to cover every person from infant to retiree who has any connection to the U.S. Embassy. They have to be covered 24/7. If they leave the embassy, they have to have coverage by the FSB. And the FSB, as I've learned, and in dealing with our own FBI, for the FBI, and I say this not as a criticism, I think it's really just a fact. For the FBI, it's a burden, a necessary burden to be sure, to monitor the Russian presence in the United States, the embassy in Washington, the consulates in Houston and New York, and their mission to the UN. But no FBI special agent gets a big promotion and awards for tailing Russian diplomats in the United States. The FSB, on the other hand, they get rewarded even if they just do, what from our perspective is foolish things to embarrass us. I'll give you one example and then I'll stop talking. I had a colleague who was going to do some grocery shopping. She left the compound by herself, drove in her white car to a local market, went into the store to do her shopping. She's trailed by the FSB. While she's in the store, this is after the special military operation had begun, the FSB goes to her car, takes a black electrical tape, and tapes a big black Z to the roof of her car. Okay. They have drones overhead with cameras to then videotape her getting into a car. She doesn't notice. Who looks at the roof of their car, right? You got groceries in your hands. Gets in her car, drives back to the embassy, and they have drones overhead to videotape her. It was on, I'm not kidding, on the nightly news as a matter of humor. Ha ha, look at how the US Embassy supports our war in Ukraine. They even drive around in cars marked with a Z. And you think about that. Think about how much effort it took to do that, right? To get a segment on the nightly news. Like, you got nothing better to do than that? They have so many officers dedicated to us. That's their pastime. Trust me. Yeah, the FBI, we can discuss the merits, demerits of the FBI for as long as you want. The FBI doesn't do that.
You also arrived in Moscow at an interesting time with the pandemic, which reshaped how diplomacy functioned globally, but also in the Russian context it's often thought to be particularly unique in shaping how Putin himself saw the world.
Yeah.
Tell us about the context of the pandemic.
So he was isolated. It's interesting because it occurred to me that there was I discovered that there was a policy, any senior Russian government official who tested positive for the virus was what we would say was hospitalized, was isolated and sent for medical treatment, observation, even if they had no symptoms, even if they weren't sick. So there were at least 2 times when Foreign Minister Lavrov wasn't available for long stretches, and he was what we would say in the United States, hospitalized for COVID. He was sent isolated. The Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov, whom I dealt with quite a bit, was missing for 2 big chunks of time. And Putin himself, as you know, famously exhibited real concern about his own health. There was, reports of a tunnel with, aerosol spray that, first of all, anybody going to see him had to isolate and be tested multiple times, and then walk through this tunnel, tent-like tunnel, which had an aerosol disinfectant. I'm not sure what it was. And then meet with him, and he would be at a great distance. There's I think it's a photograph of President Macron coming to negotiate with Putin right before, a couple of weeks before the special military operation started, and they're seated at either end of this enormous white table. In part, I think Putin and the Russians made a spectacle of it because the French Macron was not willing to be tested himself by the Russians, and the Russians thought that the French weren't being as cooperative as they should have been in their concern for President Putin's health. But he was isolated. How much of an effect that had on his decision-making, Foreign Minister Lavrov would scoff at that proposition. He was asked, and I think he said this more than once, what advisors, who's really in Putin's inner circle, whom does he listen to? And Lavrov has famously said, Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great, and Catherine the Great. There was undoubtedly a group that Putin is close to, mostly from his days in Leningrad and from his days in the KGB. Nikolai Patrushev, Igor Sechin among them, who go, that he's known and associated with for 50 years at this point. But that circle was small to begin with and got smaller during the pandemic. I'm speculating if I say it affected how much of an effect it had on his actions and his worldview, but it certainly did impact his engagement with his own government.
When you arrived, U.S. Russian relations had already been in decline for easily a decade, but they turned very much in a worse direction. When did you realize that we were headed towards, if not a conflict, at least a major crisis in the relationship?
The first indication I had, I just arrived when the government, when the Russian government announced first that that Putin was going to replace the prime minister. Medvedev was out, Mishustin was in as prime minister. And these constitutional amendments, this is roughly mid-January of 2020. And it caught us in the US government, at least those of us at the State Department, those constitutional amendments, when they were, the first time they were announced, and the change from Medvedev to Mishustin it was a surprise. And I'm in Washington, preparing to go as ambassador, and if anybody should know, if anybody in the US government was aware, I should have been told by, by the IC, et cetera. So I got there, this is January of 2020, and I described this in the book, I did a big press event at the TASS headquarters in Moscow. And there were reporters from Russian state media, editors. It was probably as large a group in a big room in the TASS headquarters, as large a group as we have here this evening. And I turned it over to questions. And most of the questions were softballs until I got to, there were some more, there were a couple of younger, I forget what media they were with, started asking me questions about foreign agents in the United States and the Foreign Agents Registration Act, which is a pre-World War II criminal statute in the United States. And they got pretty aggressive in talking about using that as a pivot to talk about, you criticize Russia and the Russian government for, violating civil liberties, lack of freedom, et cetera, et cetera. They were pretty aggressive. And I could see that the more senior people from TASS were like looking at them saying, this wasn't part of the, so that's when I started to think, there's something going on here that, that's out of, we knew it was bad, we knew the relationship was bad, but these constitutional reforms, and we knew that after that meeting at TASS, the Russian government then amends its foreign agent statute and really starts to crack down on civil society in Russia, whether it was in, what was then left of independent media in Russia, civil society and so forth. I really dated to January of 2020 myself. And not just because that's when I arrived as ambassador. It was those events that things shut down then in March because of the pandemic. Putin had to wait to have a national vote on the constitutional reforms until the end of June. Because of the pandemic, he had to delay his big program for the year, which was the Victory Day Parade on the 75th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War on May 9th. He had to delay that. So that sort of threw a bit of a monkey wrench into Putin's plans for the year. But it started off 2020 in a bad way.
And then 2021 begins and Russia starts deploying troops on the border of Ukraine. At first, this is largely ignored by the Western media. I know not ignored in government. How did you interpret what was happening in spring of 21?
So it was definitely noticed across NATO. There was a bit of a split within NATO. MI6, the UK, thought that the Russians might actually have what President Biden later called in January of 2022, a minor incursion into Ukraine. So I had a meeting at the UK embassy in Moscow. We talked through this. The US government thought that Putin was turning up the heat, but wasn't making plans sufficient to actually launch an invasion. That view changes, of course, in late October, because what we didn't see in the spring and what the US and other NATO allies' intelligence services were able to view were the logistical preparations that are necessary, fuel depots, ammunition depots, field hospitals, things that a government wouldn't do unless it really was going to launch an invasion. So the US view was US intelligence community, and I came home from Moscow at the end of April and met with fellow Bostonian, Mark Milley, the then chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he didn't think that Putin was gonna do it then. What he did say to me, and I write about this in the book though, was he said what he's doing is creating muscle memory. And when he's ready to go, having done what he did in the spring, it will be easier for him. And that's exactly what happened on a larger scale in February of 2022.
And then when we got to the fall of 22 and that second buildup started, or the buildup restarted, there was still debate among NATO allies as to how to interpret it. The US and UK on one side, I think the French and Germans
Yeah,
on the other. Can you tell us what you can about those
Sure.
internal debates about it?
there wasn't debate within the US government. Bill Burns was directed by President Biden to go to Moscow. I happened to be home. It just started home. I hadn't had a vacation because of the pandemic. I'd been stuck in Moscow for almost a year and a half. I was home on leave and I got summoned to a meeting at the State Department. It was very late October, and as great and as talented as the officials are in the US intelligence community, it's very difficult for them to reach consensus on an issue. And it was, I mean, there were not a lot of qualifications. The assessment was the Russian, Putin, he is going to do it. And President Biden then sent Bill Burns. I was home in Washington, so I got to travel with Ambassador Burns to Moscow and conveyed that message directly to Putin, to the then Secretary of the Russian Security Council, Patrushev, and to the heads of the SVR and the FSB, that we know what you're planning to do. Don't do it. The consequences for Russia will be catastrophic. So there wasn't a lot of debate there was no real debate within the US government. The consensus was, I at least was highly confident that Putin was going to do it. And every engagement over the next 3 or 4 months, November, December, January, February, every engagement, and I write about this in the book, every engagement I had with Russian interlocutors made me even more convinced. They were engaged in what I describe as sham diplomacy. There was no give and take. They would read talking points at me or to my colleagues, and including Lavrov, who is usually willing to, be a little bit more freewheeling in his discussions with an American Secretary of State. But there was no back and forth. There was no meetings that I had. I would go in and I'd speak as I am speaking to you now. I would have a brief. I'd be well prepared, but willing to talk about, you name it, Minsk agreements, whatever. My Russian counterpart would read his talking points. I would raise a question and I could see he would go back, and this isn't just Ryabkov, Grushko, you name it, go back and find in his talking points the most relevant one and reread it. And it wasn't just in this context, but it was clear to me, particularly at the MFA, that the deputy foreign ministers that I was engaging with had a large retinue of staff who were with them. And among those staff, we knew there were SVR officers who were watching what the deputy foreign minister was saying to me. And it wasn't just about, high level, big topics like potential invasion in Ukraine. It's a much different experience being Deputy Foreign Minister of the Russian Federation than it is being Deputy Secretary of State in the United States. The FBI is either really, really good, and I didn't recognize that my staff of Foreign Service officers were actually special agents of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or trust me, I spent a lot of time dealing, engaging with RIC, including FBI, counterintelligence section of the FBI, the agency, DIA, you name it. But if you're a Russian deputy foreign minister, they're still keeping an eye on you. And in that context, when it's something that important, they can't vary from their talking points. They can't run the risk that they emphasize something maybe that didn't deserve emphasis. It's that too important. So they were scripted. There was no opportunity for back and forth. It was demands. It was sham diplomacy, I say, because they presented, if you look at the chronology, they presented 2 draft treaties to the United States, one purporting to be between the United States and Russia, the other between NATO and Russia, which made ridiculous demands that no American president could ever agree to. And they never varied. Their talking points were, we told you what our security requirements are. Go back and reread the draft treaties we gave you. And this continued through January. It was only when we in the United States drafted a written response to those draft treaties, which we prefaced by saying, we want to engage with you about your concerns about NATO and Europe and about Ukraine. But there were some things that were just non-negotiable, vitiating terms of the treaty that creates NATO, the Atlantic Charter, that we were just not open to debate with any American president. It was only until we delivered that document that the Russians stopped saying to me, we really shouldn't be talking to you anyway, because you still haven't given us a written response to our 2 draft treaties. I personally delivered on behalf of Secretary Blinken this document in the form of a letter to Lavrov, and that finally removed that talking point from the list that the MFA, or actually the office of, I also engaged with the Office of Presidential Administration, a guy named Kozak, who's a deputy chief of staff to President Putin, and at the time was responsible. He's born in Ukraine, but served in the GRU, settled in Leningrad after his military service, and had been with Putin since the mid-90s. He was somebody who was almost on a daily basis in the fall of 2021 engaging with Yermak in Kyiv. It was MFA, it was the Kremlin. The first stiff arm was, we haven't responded in writing. Reread our talking points. They had to amend that after I delivered this written document to say, well, your written document didn't really address any of our concerns, and then insert the same talking points they've been saying for months. Sham diplomacy. They wanted to give the appearance of negotiating with the United States. And as I said at the outset, there were no negotiations.
And so at that point, by late 21, in your view, the war was essentially inevitable. The train was in motion.
I believe, I write about this in the book, as I look back now, I'm convinced that by the time that Biden met with Putin on June 16, 2021, that Putin was going to achieve soon his objectives in Ukraine to denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. And he wasn't going to talk to Biden about it. He didn't need to talk to Biden about it. As I write in my book, it did not really come up as a topic between the 2 presidents. The most important issue. So I write about this in the book. Biden and Putin meet all day in Geneva. Barely discussed Ukraine. They discussed Afghanistan a lot more than they discussed Ukraine. Putin's press conference, it was back-to-back press conferences. It was Putin first, then Biden. First question to Putin at his press conference from state media, which means Putin asking himself a question. The question was, what did you talk to Biden about the most important issue for all Russians, which is Ukraine? And Putin said, it really didn't come up. Biden said that, their Ukrainian vassals should comply with the Minsk agreements, and I hope he gets them to do it. There was no discussion between Putin and Biden. Putin didn't need to discuss it with anybody. He was going to do what he needed to do to achieve his war aims, denazify and demilitarize Ukraine. And I maintain it wasn't, I'm asked all the time, what role did the catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan have on Putin's decision-making? And the suggestion being that, well, until then, that's when Putin really realized, boy, I can really get away with something here and invade Ukraine. The United States really is, to quote my former boss, Secretary Rumsfeld, a cheap hamburger stand. No, he had already decided before that. I mean, Afghanistan didn't help in trying, I think he was undeterrable at that point. And it certainly didn't help in trying to deter Putin from doing it. But he was going to achieve his war aims at that point by hook or crook. Either Ukraine was going to capitulate, Ukraine was going to be handed over by the West on a silver platter, or he was going to have to use what the Russians call military technical means, an invasion.
Well, I'd like to open up pretty soon to questions, and I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions about the path forwards from here, from the audience. So maybe before I do that, a question on your service as a diplomat, because you, of course, served under two very different presidents on an issue that was a priority in public debate under both administrations. Right. What did you learn about that process?
So I wrote about this in the book. The practical change for me wasn't on substantive policies. There were some differences, but the biggest change for me, for those of you who have, who have worked in government or served in a U.S. embassy, was I got my instructions from Washington, from leadership in Washington in the Trump administration, from Secretary Pompeo in the Department of State. I talked to Secretary Pompeo a lot. Not surprising, I had served as his deputy for 2 years, first year under Secretary Tillerson, 2 years under Pompeo, but I never spoke to President Trump as his ambassador. That changed with the Biden administration. Now, I had plenty of conversations, some substantive conversations with Secretary Blinken, but the real instructions I got, do this, do that, hold off on this, came from President Biden from the White House. So, looking at it as just in a very practical way, where I was getting my instructions from changed from Department of State to the White House in the Biden administration. And I think it's a fair, I think looking back on it now, I think there was a pretty significant shift in authority within, from the Trump administration to the Biden administration in, the NSC exercising much more of a role than it did when I was ambassador. I didn't speak, I don't think I spoke once or twice to Robert O'Brien, who was then the National Security Advisor in the last year of the Trump administration, and it was about wrongfully detained Americans. I spoke all the time to the NSC once the Biden administration came into office, much less so, that's not right. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, but there were more authoritative statements coming from the NSC in the Biden administration than there were in the Trump administration. And that's just a fact.
And what about your role personally? Because of course there weren't many officials at your level who served under Trump and then were retained under Biden. A couple of examples perhaps, but you must have been unique in your ability to navigate public service in a highly charged domestic political environment. What lessons are there to draw from that?
Yeah, there weren't many of us. And Roger Carstens, who was the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs, Roger had been appointed. Actually, when Robert O'Brien left that post to become national security advisor to President Trump, Roger became the special presidential envoy for hostage affairs. An important post, and in particularly over the years is unfortunately the number of Americans who have been wrongfully detained in a variety of countries has grown. Roger was kept. There were a couple, David Satterfield, if you know David, was Trump's ambassador to Turkey. But David, he was technically a political, but he had been a foreign service officer, career senior foreign service officer who had to resign from the service to take an appointment with the UN at the Sinai monitoring mission. And when Rex Tillerson brought him back to do it more quickly, we brought him back as a political, and he didn't re-access into the foreign service. So I think as a technical matter, I'm the only ambassador that, other than career officers, that President Biden kept. I'd developed over the years, a good relationship with Secretary Blinken, and the administration, the Biden administration, had business that they wanted to conduct immediately on day one with the Russians, and I think they wanted to have continuity. So I was thrilled when I was asked to stay, and we had business to do right away. I write about it in the book. We extended the New START Treaty, which was going to expire on February 5th of 2021. We had a whole host of things that we were working on, and I hope, including in today's world with the headlines we see in Washington, that young people, particularly students at the school, are discouraged from going into government service, because there's one thing that I've learned over 4 decades now, going in and out of government, how important the role of the State Department is. There's a reason that the Secretary of State is the most senior member of the cabinet. It is the indispensable cabinet member for any president to engage with foreign sovereigns. He's the president of the United States. He or she's got to have a Secretary of State, and that secretary has to be backed by a department in this day and age. And I've said this to President Trump himself, he would sometimes correct me and say, if I remember in one case in particular, we were talking about an issue at a particular embassy, and he thought I was being too solicitous of the embassy's interests and, protecting our staff there. And he said, that's just because you're the Deputy Secretary of State and you want to protect the State Department's embassy. And I said, no, sir, that's your embassy. That's the United States Embassy. It's not just the State Department. It is a country team of, depending on the size of the mission, virtually every element of the U.S. government. It's not just the State Department. But the backbone, the management functions that keep those missions, those embassies and consulates running, is the State Department. So I was honored to serve and continue to serve under both Presidents Trump and Biden.
Well, we have some time for questions. I have a number of questions of my own, but let me start by opening up to the audience. If you have questions, please come up to one of the microphones and I'll call on you. Introduce yourself as well to the ambassador so he knows who's asking the question.
Hi, this on. Yeah. Hi, Nasser. My name is Gio. I'm a second year law student. Yeah. Yes. So With North Macedonia joining NATO in 2020, Finland joining in 2023, Sweden joining in 2024, and Bosnia and Herzegovina, Georgia, and Ukraine aspiring to join NATO. In your professional opinion as a diplomat, would adding Bosnia, Georgia, and Ukraine to NATO serve as a deterrent to Russia, since the U.S., Britain, France, and Russia are nuclear powers, and conventional wisdom teaches that a war amongst nuclear powers would be catastrophic for humanity, or would it not? Why or why not? And what do you think a post-Putin Russia would look like? Are you optimistic, pessimistic, or indifferent? Why or why not?
Two small questions.
Two small questions. Let me start with the NATO question. First, all those countries you mentioned, whether it's Bosnia, Herzegovina, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine, that is, as I said in my opening remarks, we particularly after the war started, talk about red lines for Putin. NATO membership for those countries is as bright a red line for Putin. He will not compromise on that. But here's my view on, because I heard this relentlessly, first as deputy secretary and then as ambassador, the Russian narrative about the NATO expansion east. And here's the fundamental flaw with that from my point of view. What that really reflects is there's active debate in the United States, in the alliance, in the late 90s, should these countries, particularly the former Soviet republics of Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, should they be admitted to NATO? George Kennan in 1997 takes a pretty harsh view saying this is going to provoke the Russians. Don't do it. There is debate within NATO capitals. And the consensus developed that we were going to admit these countries to NATO. Why? It was NATO moving east. It was over 100 million people in Eastern Europe looking west. And their rights as Latvians, Poles, Czechs, Romanians to decide for themselves that their future for them, for their posterity, for their country is with the EU and NATO, and not with the behemoth to the east that had kept them under the thumb of either, if they were Soviet republics, control from the center in Moscow, or the Warsaw Pact. So what to accept the Russian position is to substitute for the judgments of these tens of millions of people in those countries that you mentioned about what's right for their future and their security, and substitute the judgment of Moscow for those countries, to deny them their sovereign rights. What the Russians would say is, look, we in the United States, through the CIA, through USAID, by the way, Russian social media is having a field day today about USAID and what's happening, because as the Russians would tell you, USAID has always been a front for the CIA, and that's what Donald Trump is really doing here. But but seriously, to get back to the important point, it's Russians, Putin hates competition. He's not willing to compete in a democratic election, can't risk losing. He's not willing to compete for hearts and minds in Ukraine, Belarus, Poland, you name it. He's going to get control over those countries, which is most important to him. And he's not going to risk, subjecting the important interests, his imperial ambitions, addressing the great geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century, which is not the demise of Soviet communism, it's the demise of the Soviet Empire. It's control from the center in Moscow. What happens, that great geopolitical catastrophe, is that huge behemoth of 350 million people, 15 republics, those internal boundaries become international borders. That's the great geopolitical catastrophe. Control from the center in Moscow is eliminated, and that's what he's gonna restore.
You want to take the question of Russia under Putin as well?
Good Lord, I have trouble enough trying to master Russian under Putin to the extent I have. One of my predecessors, John Taft, wrote a piece. This was in 2018, after Putin was reelected in March of 2018, when we in the West weren't sure whether, as ultimately happened, Putin would comply with the term limits in the Russian constitution or amend them. And he did it in a Chekist way, right? He amended the constitution to actually make the term limits themselves, the term limit provision in the Russian constitution even tougher, because he made it so that you could only serve 2 terms. Previously, it had been 2 consecutive terms, which is why he served 2 terms, takes a term off, serves 2 more terms. He toughens it. So like the American Constitution, only 2 terms, except a minor proviso. That new rule isn't applicable to the current president or the former president. Go figure. So John Taft, Ambassador Taft, wrote this piece for RAND, mapping out what does succession for Putin look like. And my God, it made, politics, I mean, John is an expert on this. The politics involved families, oligarchs, all of the interests that are gonna be at play. I couldn't begin to disaggregate. What I would say, and I would repeat what Russians, and I believe this, is regime change, for all the problems the United States has with the Russian Federation and Putin's Kremlin, regime change isn't the answer. The successor to Putin from the West's perspective, and the West is the United States and our vassals, is Putin's successor may be worse. In fact, may likely be worse. And I heard this from pro-Z Russian nationalists who were telling me, be careful, because replace Putin. By the way, I don't know if you've seen these news stories now that, I guess it was Tucker Carlson. There's some story that the United States has had a plot to assassinate Putin, and it was really have you seen this run by my friend Tony Blinken? But this gets serious coverage in Russian media. So anyway, it's not a good answer to your question because I don't have the faintest idea.
Please.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Switch it on. Yep.
Thank you, Ambassador, for sharing your experiences. My name is Arman Mathur. I'm a first year bond. I'm a scholar in Indian foreign policy, and that's why my question is going to change gear a little bit. I think Russia's war against the West is a very important keyword. And what we saw immediately after the sort of Russian invasion of Ukraine was that the West chose to frame it as, of course, a very egregious violation of sovereignty, inviolability of territorial integrity. But there were a lot of countries, including those which have strategic partnerships with the West and especially with the United States, including, of course, India, which had deep interests and deep long-standing partnerships with Russia. And they chose to do what they wanted to do, which is, continue importing oil and other things. And eventually, the strategic partnerships continued. And I mean, as of today, they've become stronger. So I'm piqued to know what exactly was the chatter within the American foreign policy establishment when these countries didn't toe the line?
Great question. And I write about in my book, it's really, there are so many failures of diplomacy with leadership and diplomacy with respect to Russia's aggressive war, and I use the legal term, crime against peace, that Putin has committed with respect to the Ukraine, but not being able to convince. And there are some hard cases. India's one, Egypt's another. These are countries that have long-standing relationships back to Soviet days, to Soviet military, KGB. So when the U.S. is engaged with the Pakistanis, opposing the Soviets in Afghanistan, the Indian military has developed relationships over decades with the Red Army. And I've had Indian diplomats say to me, we can't turn that off like that. We're too dependent in some ways, our bureaucracy, same with the Egyptians and other countries as well. So it was disappointing to see, for example, my colleagues at U.S. UN at our mission to the United Nations doing a great job marshaling votes for the General Assembly. There were 2 resolutions, and the language that was passed was condemned and deplored the special military operation and ordered the Russian military to withdraw. It was a related ICJ, International Court of Justice decision that rejected Russian claims of Putin's claims of a Ukrainian genocide against Russia in Ukraine, and ordering the Russian military, Russia to withdraw from Ukrainian territory. But all those countries that voted, the 143, I think it was for the first, and roughly the same number for the second, many of them did absolutely nothing to oppose the Russians and continuing doing business with Russia. And some of the largest and most, some of the largest economies, I'm thinking of the BRICS, Brazil, South Africa, India, not only continued to do business with Russia, India buying oil, South Africa hosting Russian naval ships for naval exercises off the coast of South Africa. Same for Brazil. Failure by the United States to convince what's often called the global South to oppose this. The Russians call us in the West the golden billion, and there's the rest of the world that what the Russians are focused on. Putin is trying to, as he and his government say, sort of do the inverse of Peter the Great and reorient Russia south and east. I'm not sure how successful he's going to be in that, but it's certainly a failure of leadership and diplomacy by the United States and the West, and not pointing out all of the reasons why the entire world should repudiate what Russia's done to Ukraine, as 143 countries did in the General Assembly almost 3 years ago now.
Abby, is it open?
There you go.
Yes. Good to have you, Ambassador Sullivan. I'm Ning Yuan, a first-year grad student here. 2 weeks before the invasion to Ukraine happened, Putin was in Beijing, talking with Xi during the open ceremony of the Winter Olympic, whom I believe is the last world leader before the war happened that he met face to face. So my question would be, what role did China play in this? And were there any interactions with your Chinese counterparts when you were in Moscow? And what were your experience with it?
No, I do so many of these talks that it's rare for me to get a question that I haven't heard before. That's the first time I've been asked about, I never requested nor received a request to meet with the PRC's ambassador when I was in Moscow. Never met that person. It was certainly an event that the United States paid very close attention to when Putin, at the time it was day by day, hour by hour at that point from my perspective, when is the invasion going to start? And we had, on the calendar, the Olympics are on the calendar. How is that going to factor into when Putin, his decision to launch the invasion, how much time he's going to have in the spring, et cetera. And that visit was a key moment that the United States paid very close attention to. There's that extraordinarily long and extraordinarily significant joint statement that the two governments released, where they the commitments that they make, that describing the relationship as even stronger than, a military alliance, they don't say NATO, but stronger than a military alliance, unlimited friendship between the two countries. So that was in further confirmation that, from my perspective, sitting at Embassy Moscow, this was coming after the Olympics ended, and it worked out that way. What's interesting though is if you look back on the nuclear threats that Putin has made over time, starting days after the special military operation starts. I think there's a rally at Luzhniki Stadium in Moscow, and it's a pro-war rally. And in connection with that, Putin announces that he's given an order to the aerospace and rocket forces to put Russian, rockets and missiles on some form of heightened alert. He in his statements in the week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, leading up to the invasion on Thursday, he said something to the effect of, anybody who thinks of opposing us should recognize the power that we have, the new weapon systems that we have. I'm not sure how that went over in Beijing. I think, I don't know, and I've not been briefed on what the United States believes Putin said to Xi in early February about the special military operation. I have to believe that whatever Putin said, it didn't indicate to Xi that it was going to last for 3 years and cost, upwards of 700,000 killed or wounded among Russian and North Korean military. Certainly not the latter part. The involvement of the DPRK, not a good thing from Beijing's perspective. But the last time that the PRC used that expression, I believe the only time, somebody here will correct me if I misspeak, I believe the only time that the PRC has used the phrase unlimited friendship was in that statement. The Russians have said it many times since. When in the summer of 2022, when the war really, despite almost daily statements by the Kremlin, by the Ministry of Defense, that the special military operation was going according to plan. And of course, we had planned, this is exactly how we wanted to have the special military operation roll out. As the Russian military is collapsing around Kharkiv and about to be driven out of Kherson, several things happen in the summer. Prigozhin is allowed to recruit prisoner volunteers in the Russian prisons, and I believe it's on the 21st of September. The language of the Kremlin changes, and Putin announces what they call mobilization. It's really more conscription. Putin's really got to acknowledge that the war's not going according to plan. It's when he starts to call it a war, and we Western media misinterpret that as Putin saying, I started a war. He's saying the United States started a war against Russia in Ukraine. Our response was the limited defensive special military operation. But he ratchets up the nuclear rhetoric. And that's when I believe over the course of 2022, there were several indications that leadership in Beijing is not enthusiastic, even with nuclear rhetoric and threats, let alone use of a nuclear weapon in any way, tactical demonstration, etc., in connection with the special military operation. So therefore, we know there's at least one limit to the unlimited friendship, and the PRC does not use that expression anymore in describing, particularly after he poached on their vassal in Pyongyang. That didn't go over well in Beijing. That's their vassal. Sending, it's one thing for the DPRK, by former President Trump calling, for Little Rocket Man to send an artillery shell. But, you know, thousands of North Korean troops, that's not something that I can't imagine any of this was contemplated by the two leaders when they met in Beijing in early February of 2022. You know, I gotta believe that Xi's view is, what's wrong with you? Why didn't you get this over with, you know? So,
Thank you.
thanks.
On the nuclear question, I can follow up there,
Sure.
since we haven't touched on it. I think David saying of the New York Times has reported that the US intelligence community was quite worried about nuclear threats, especially in late 2022, as not just being threats, but actually being something the Russian leadership might carry through on. In looking back, do you have the same assessment now?
So I can't get into anything classified. I never shared the view that that there, look, if it's a threat of nuclear war, any president has obviously got to take that very seriously. I thought what was more likely was if it were to be the use of an unconventional weapon or a weapon of mass destruction, would have been the use of a chemical weapon, the way Assad used chemical weapons in Syria when in April and May, the Russian military is approaching Mariupol. So if you've ever seen images or video of what Mariupol looks like, and that huge steelworks, the Azovstal steelworks, it looks like Stalingrad in January 1943. Potentially huge Russian casualties in trying to reduce that city, capture an extremely important port, symbolically, logistically, and I thought maybe we might use a chemical weapon there, but I overestimated his concern for the lives of his own troops, and he didn't use it. I've never thought, the only time, well, I believe the only time that Putin would consider the use of that type of weapon would be if in June of 2023, instead of Wagner elements on the move from Rostov to Moscow, it was either Wagner elements or just plain Ukrainian armed forces shooting down Russian helicopters as they're on the march to Moscow. Then we're talking. It was, so I want to be careful because it gets really bad. If you look back now, from Putin's perspective, the second half of 22 is really bad. I mean, they collapse around Kharkiv, they lose Kherson, huge casualties, heightened expectations in the West for a Ukrainian offensive in 2023. But I don't think, I mean, for that threat to be real, it had to be something like the Prigozhin mutiny and march toward Moscow that really was going to threaten the regime. I mean, think about what the Ukrainians did in and around Kursk, right? I mean, that didn't do it. And he's, the first Russian leader since Stalin to lose Russian territory. So I've always been skeptical that, but it's easy for me to say, I'm not the commander in chief sitting in the Oval Office, but it was, so that's my own view. I can tell you from my perch in Moscow, engaging with my colleagues back in DC, particularly at the White House, it was a real concern for concerns. Use of unconventional weapons, particularly nuclear weapons, or second, and this I thought potentially more likely, a military strike on NATO territory for where we're, marshaling yards, where we're, assembling material to send to. Those were the two real fears, because, an attack on Poland, Romania, et cetera. Then we've got Article 5, then we've got Biden's instruction to his senior team was do everything we can to support Ukraine, but don't get us in a war with Russia.
Thank you for being here, Ambassador. We're glad to have you, of course. I'm a senior undergraduate, senior studying political science. I have just one question for you. What are your thoughts? We talked about the IC a little bit. What are your thoughts on the confirmation of John Ratcliffe and the nomination of Tulsi Gabbard?
I've never met either individual, so it's based only on what I've read in media. I guess I would say for Director Ratcliffe, who has been confirmed, there have been some appointments in this administration that have I thought were solid. Certainly, Senator Rubio becoming Secretary Rubio had a lot of engagement with Senator Rubio as Deputy Secretary on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But interestingly enough, I had a lot of engagement with him. He was also serving on the Senate Intelligence Committee. And I had a lot of, which is not typical for an ambassador, but Moscow is not a typical post. I had a lot of engagement with the Senate Intelligence Committee as ambassador, both virtually by secure video conference when I was in Moscow and also when I was home. So I've gotten to know Senator Rubio really well. I think it's a great pick. And I say that not just because I married into an extended Cuban family. And same for Mike Waltz, who's the National Security Advisor, and Ratcliffe for CIA. Tulsi Gabbard, I understand my senators have serious questions about some of the things she said and places that she's traveled and people she's met with. I don't know that I can say more than that.
A couple more questions then, please.
Thank you, Ambassador. I'm a sophomore undergrad student. I'm studying international relations. So this one is more of a personal question. So on the day when the war started, I was in Moscow. I was in high school then.
Really?
Yep. So my question is, how would you describe this first hours or maybe minutes?
Yeah.
How were you feeling? Because I guess for everyone who was there or have any connections to Russia, they have some specific, very personal feelings about this specific terrible day.
Yeah, so it's interesting because you can imagine we at the embassy had to be prepared for anything, right? So when the war starts, I didn't know if there were gonna be big protests outside, if we were gonna be locked in, barricaded. We had occasional people jumping the fence unrelated to the special military operation over the 3 years that I was there. We had one day, somebody came up and had an enormous plastic bag, clear plastic full of blood, and threw it over the wall. It turned out to be animal blood, not human blood, but it's Moscow, anything could happen. So we are on our toes, meeting, they're called Emergency Action Committee meetings, EACs, almost daily, getting reports about what's happening in the city, sending people out to view what's going on. We know the war's coming. What's gonna happen to us? Do we send dependents home? How do we continue our operations? Are our children at the embassy gonna continue to be able to get, we had school buses, Anglo-American School is founded by the U.S. Embassy, UK and Canadian embassies decades ago. We have school buses going to school, all of this stuff. Parents are worried about their kids. And the war starts. And then it's almost like the phony war after the Germans invade Poland, it's like we're in London in December of 1939. There's a war on, but the Lamborghini dealership is closed and the Gucci store near the Kremlin has the lights on and a polite note on the front door that says, temporarily closed. But otherwise, we would go in to stores to report back to Washington. What did we see? We weren't able to travel. So we were trying to report back what we could to Washington about what was happening in Moscow. We continued to go out. We had tours, weekend events for families go. I remember I did a tour of St. Basil's Cathedral After the war had started, went to the Kremlin with a group, we went on a tour. So there really wasn't a sense, our engagement with the Russian government basically shut down. Very few engagements. But walking around Moscow, hard to tell that there was a war going on. That all changed. It starts to change in September of 22. When I said Putin's rhetoric changes, Prigozhin is already recruiting in the prisons. He's ordered mobilization. And October and November or December, it's a really bad time for him. And there was an increase. I left in September of 22, right as this was happening. Over the rest of the fall and early winter, a definite increase in the harassment. I didn't think that was possible, but there was a definite uptick in the smothering of the embassy. And I'll give you two examples, both related to my successor, Lynn Tracy, terrific career, senior foreign service officer, former DCM in Moscow, former ambassador to Armenia. So Lynn gets there in late January of 23. And the Russians did something to her that they never did to me in 3 years. She went on her first of all, her first day, she stays overnight in the residence, arrives at the embassy, walks into the chancery, and the power goes out. So we have a whole host of, we have formal rules for special operating procedures of the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, our mission to Russia, because of the counterintelligence threat. So it's a big book, classified book on procedures that aren't applied at any other embassy around the world. Those are the official Moscow rules. Then there are the unofficial Moscow rules, which is just sort of collected wisdom and common sense. And the number one rule is there are no coincidences. The fact that the power went out literally as Lynn's, the Marines in their dress blues with the white gloves opening the door for a boom. She then goes later that day to get her cartochka, her little diplomatic card, legal proof that she's got diplomatic immunity. It's not, she presents her credentials, but it's not the formal credentialing ceremony that Putin hosts in the Kremlin Palace. When she goes to the MFA for this meeting with Deputy Foreign Minister Ryabkov, and she pulls up, and this never happened to me in 3 years. There's a crowd, probably the size of the crowd here, with signs in English, protesting the United States, chanting, blood on your hands, warmongers, blah, 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 as she walks in to the front door of the ministry. That never happened to me. I was always treated with respect. They never, there would never be a protest like that. It's just an example, a little thing of how things changed. So while I was there, it wasn't, after the war started, the significant change was I wasn't going to meetings at the ministry. But after I left, things did change, and particularly for my successor.
We're almost out of time. Let's do one final question if we can, please.
Please, thank you for being here. I have one question. In the light of the recent political discourse and past statement from President Trump, suggesting a potential U.S. withdrawal from NATO, how do you foresee such a move impacting NATO's role and cohesion as an international organization? Specifically, if the withdrawal were to be framed as a strategy to indirectly pressure Russia into ending its war in Ukraine, what do you believe the long-term consequence will be for the U.S. alliances as well as global security?
Yeah, so U.S. withdrawal from NATO?
Yes.
I am convinced almost to a moral certainty that will not happen. President Trump has, both in his first term and now, at the start of his second term, has expressed a lot of displeasure with NATO, mostly focused on defense spending by our NATO allies. The NATO allies in 2000 made a commitment at a NATO leaders meeting in Wales, so-called Wales commitment of 2% of GDP spent on defense and 20% of that spending on new weapon systems. And President Trump has been banging the drum about NATO allies that aren't meeting those commitments. He goes much farther than that to suggest that he would not be in favor of the U.S. suggesting that the U.S. wouldn't honor its treaty commitment under NATO if a NATO ally were attacked by Russia, for example, and that NATO ally hadn't met its financial commitments. President Trump has suggested that it would, should the United States defend that country? First of all, if the United States withdrew from NATO, it would be monumental, is an understatement, achievement for Vladimir Putin. And second, catastrophic in the extreme for the United States and its national security. Anybody who thinks, if President Trump or any American who is critical of the Biden administration and the withdrawal from Afghanistan thinks that had an American credibility, and you can go back in history to all of the great debacles, the withdrawal from Saigon in April of '75, they pale in comparison to what would happen to the reputation, credibility, and security of the United States if the United States were to withdraw from the alliance created after the Second World War that has maintained peace in Europe up to February 24th, for the most part, February 24th of 2022. So I can't think of many senators who would be in favor of that. And ultimately, my hope and expectation is President Trump hates to lose, and I believe those around him would tell him this is a losing proposition for the United States if you withdraw from NATO.
Well, Ambassador, I would like to thank you for spending time with us this evening. Thank you for writing Midnight in Moscow, which I think will be read by students not only here, but students of the origins of the war for many years to come. And thank you also for providing an example of public service on an issue that's been at the center of domestic U.S. political debate over two very different administrations. I think is an admirable lesson for students here to serve in a contested area in a time of political dispute. So thank you for joining us, and I very much appreciate that.
Thank you.